Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 26, Tecumseh, Tippecanoe, and the War of 1812. Next on the pseudo-history deep dive is cherry-picking. Cherry-picking is a logical fallacy when someone focuses only on evidence that supports their stance while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. For example, a person who engages in cherry-picking might mention only a small number of studies out of all the studies published on a particular topic to make it look as if the historic consensus matches their stance. Cherry-picking can impact how people think and therefore how people research in the historical community. For example, one issue that has been known to be problematic in research is creating a thesis after the cause of a historical event is already known. In this situation, people sort through information, looking specifically for data, examples, samples, and interpretations that give potential solid support for their thesis, even though doing this negates the validity of their research. This phenomenon is true in many cases, which can ultimately impact systemic reviews of study. Ignoring contradictory evidence to a central thesis in the historical community has been equated to sweeping inconvenient facts under the rug to make a straightforward interpretation of a complex reality. Cherry-picking is most commonly a sign of laziness, poor research practices, and good old-fashioned bullheadedness, which indicates weak writing. I like to think that there are two varieties of cherry pickers, those purely motivated by laziness and those inspired by utter villainy. Although the former situation is slightly more understandable, both are awful, and you should avoid becoming either at all costs. Wait to write a concrete thesis statement until you have completed a substantial amount of research. This will save you time later in your project. It's okay and even encouraged to include dissenting voices in your academic work. The ability to introduce and then effectively shut down the opposition is one that will impress your readers and reaffirm your side of the argument. It's easy to get so wrapped up in your understanding of your chosen topic and argument that sometimes you can become blind to the flaws in your work. These peer readers can include friends, family members, classmates, mentors, and even your students. Consider bringing an outside pair of eyes in to look at your work in both its early and later stages to help identify potential points of weakness before they get too far along. Tecumseh. Historians are paying renewed attention to the conflict on the western frontier, the Old Northwest for the United States and Upper Canada for the British. Once an academic backwater, the war is now seen as an important event in forging three national identities: Canadian, American, and the pan-tribal American Indian. The battles here now look like the culmination of a generation of formidable native resistance to Euro-American encroachment. The central figure of the last stage of this fight is Tecumseh, born in Ohio in 1768 and killed in 1813 defending Moraviantown in Canada against an invading U.S. Army. He has won grudging respect in United States history. The Kentucky officer who claimed to have killed him was later elected Vice President of the U.S. primarily because of that feat. His nemesis William Henry Harrison, campaigning to defeat Tecumseh's brother at Tippecanoe, became president. For the natives of the Northwest Territory, later become the American states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the war that ended in Canada had begun decades early along the Ohio River. Although Great Britain abandoned its nominal claim to the region after American independence, the tribal federations asserted their sovereignty over the territory. An alliance of tribes in Ohio took arms to resist American settlements on their land. In 1790 and again in 1791, they inflicted two of the most severe defeats ever suffered by the U.S. Army. In 1 hour of battle on November 4, 1791, Indian sharpshooters led by the Miami chief Little Turtle annihilated an entire army led by Northwest Territories Governor Arthur St. Clair. Nearly 700 American soldiers were killed. The disaster spurred the young republic to an extraordinary military effort. President George Washington devoted 80% of the increase in his entire federal budget to preparing the 1794 campaign led by Major General Anthony Wayne, quadrupling his defense spending. Congress also responded with the Federal Non-Intercourse Act, taking Indian policy out of the hand of state governments who were blamed for inflaming hostilities. A much better general than his predecessors, Wayne decisively defeated the Native Alliance in 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. His peace, the Treaty of Greenville, expropriated tribal lands in the South and East Ohio, but it established a line across the state, supposedly protecting Indians on the northern and western sides against further encroachment. The treaty lines, however, couldn't control powerful social forces. A flood of American immigrants into Ohio put constant pressure on Indian lands. Even worse, the impact of border fighting, dislocation, diminishing resources, disease, and, most overtly, alcohol severely weakened traditional tribal life. The turbulence and weak U.S. control in the region across the Greenville line offered a rich arena for intrigue to British agents who expected the collapse of the untested new country or eventual war with it. The British Indian Department, based in Amherstburg, Ontario, closely monitored events, providing supplies and arms to the tribes through a network of traders fluent in their languages and often married into them. As tensions waxed and waned, the opinion in the United States blamed outbreaks on British instigation, ignoring native grievances. These accusations grew into a powerful motive for the War of 1812. If British intrigues from Amherstburg were the cause of Indian unrest, the quickest way to pacify the tribes was to drive out the British. However, U.S. history's focus on maritime causes, such as the British and French commercial blockades, British impressments of American soldiers, and the spectacular U.S. naval victories, Canada's issue on the western frontier. After 1810, the war party in Congress called more and more loudly for the invasion of Canada. In the debate over the war, John Randolph, congressman from Virginia, complained, "We have heard but one word, like a whippoorwill, but one eternal monotonous tone, Canada, Canada, Canada." In opposing the war, Randolph, a descendant of Pocahontas, made the remarkable statement that the Indians had a just cause. It was our thirst for territory, our want for moderation, that had driven these sons of nature to desperation, of which we felt the effects. As Randolph and very few other Americans admitted, Indians had their motives in the conflict, and two historic native personalities, who happened to be brothers, were driving the events. Tecumseh, the famed war leader, was a middle child in a large family of a Shawnee father and Creek mother. The parents met when a group of Shawnee took refuge in Creek villages in Alabama during the 1750s. Tecumseh, a well-favored popular youth, seemed destined for a traditional career as a war leader, the role of his tribal division. A failure in hunting and war, he developed into an overweight alcoholic before an event that changed the lives of the brothers and all Indians in the Old Northwest. One evening on April 1805, while lighting his pipe, Tecumseh's brother collapsed in a trance. Taken for dead, he awoke as his family prepared for his funeral and reported a vision of heaven and hell. The Masters of Life had chosen him to save the Indians. Thus began his transformation into the prophet. He preached a return to traditional ways, forbidding whiskey and American merchandise. Americans, he said, had not created by the Master of Life, but by the Great Serpent, a water being possibly with ancient roots in the Mississippian culture. By following the Master of Life and himself, Indians would overthrow American power. His new religion is what sociologists call a revitalization movement, an attempt to restore order to a society under extreme external pressure. It spread rapidly but unevenly, meeting resistance from older chiefs but winning adherents across tribal bounds. Pilgrims from tribes as remote as the Ojibwe came to a new settlement established by the prophet and run by Tecumseh. The religion took a big step beyond traditionalism. It preached to all Indians as a single people, not just as tribal members. This pan-tribalism transformed Tecumseh's outlook too. Politicizing the movement, he began to argue that the land of the Indian side of the Greenville line was Indian country owned in common by all the tribes. No single tribe could sell any of it to Americans without the consent of all the other tribes. A great orator, Tecumseh began to travel far and wide to win tribes to his principles and create a grand confederacy to resist the United States expansion. He visited Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison. After a tense confrontation caused Harrison to draw a sword, Tecumseh managed to allay his suspicions temporarily. Harrison was deeply impressed. Tecumseh, he later wrote, is one of those uncommon geniuses which springs up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. But Tecumseh declined Harrison's invitation to visit Washington, D.C. However, Tecumseh led a large delegation to Amherstburg, where the British were playing a delicate game of Indian relations. After a naval incident in 1807 nearly led to war with the United States, British officials in Upper Canada realized they would need strong Indian allies. They worked through Matthew Elliott, an Irish-American Tory exile from Pennsylvania who owned a large plantation in Amherstburg and served, off and on, as head of the Indian Department. He had married a Shawnee woman and spoke the language fluently. Elliott kept close ties with Tecumseh and the Prophet and sent supplies to their settlement. Elliott privately was encouraged a war alliance with Britain while they publicly denied its support. British officers complained that Elliott did his work too eagerly. In 1808, Tecumseh and the Prophet had relocated their religious settlement to the far side of the Indian Territory by the conjunction of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers. As it was known, Prophetstown eventually drew nearly 3,000 Indian inhabitants, coming in from the west and Ohio. In 1811, Tecumseh set off on his last incredible diplomatic journey to win support for the powerful tribes of the southeast. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw rejected his confederacy, and he had only limited access among his mother's people, the Creek. Even worse, Harrison saw Tecumseh's absence as a chance to achieve his long-simmering goal of dispersing Prophetstown. On November, Harrison marched 1,000 troops to the outskirts of Prophetstown. The Prophet decided on a pre-dawn attack, never a great warrior, relying on the master life for victory. The battle was a draw, but the unexpected casualties demoralized the Prophetstown's defenders, and they abandoned the village. Harrison and his men burned down the town and its food stores to the ground. The Prophet's reputation never recovered. When Tecumseh returned, he saw his grand plan shattered and bitterly blamed his brother. But it is hard to see what else could have been done in the face of Harrison's provocation, and Tecumseh might deserve some of the blame for leaving his base unsecured. Tecumseh tried to appease Harrison and rebuild his alliance in the coming months, but they all were about to be overtaken by events far away. On June 1, 1812, President James Madison sent his war message to Congress. Although most of it dealt with the maritime blockade, he also accused the British of Indian unrest. It is difficult to account for the activity and combinations which have some time been developing themselves among tribes in constant intercourse with British traders and garrisons without connecting their hostilities with that influence. As Congress declared war on June 28, Tecumseh and his party of warriors were going to Amherstburg. Although it was an anticlimax to Tecumseh's career, his small force was about to play the role that British policy had long contemplated. It joined the defense of Fort Malden near Amherstburg under the command of Major General Isaac Brock, who badly needed reinforcements. A 2,000-strong U.S. force under Governor William Hull had crossed from Detroit into Canada, but the advance stalled. The newly bolstered British Indian force succeeded in driving the Americans back across the Detroit River and eventually capturing Fort Detroit. Because of the village's strategic location, the victory was decisive, giving Brock, Tecumseh, and their men control over all of Michigan territory. Brock admired Tecumseh's cunning, telling the British Prime Minister, "A more gallant and sagacious warrior does not exist." It seemed Tecumseh had finally found a British commander he could rely on. But it wouldn't last. 3 months after the siege of Detroit, Brock died in combat. Major General Henry Proctor's replacement lacked his predecessor's courage and concern for Indian allies, preferring to withdraw into British territory and defend rather than attack American forces in the Old Northwest. On several occasions, he ordered his troops to fall back without notice to Indian compatriots. Doubt and distrust among the armies crippled morale. Almost exactly a year after Brock's death, Americans reclaimed Detroit and invaded Canada. Now, under the command of William Henry Harrison, they were advancing on the British and Indian Army near Moraviantown, just 80 miles northeast of the recovered fort. On the morning of October 5, 1813, Proctor commanded his forces to flee, but Tecumseh refused to turn and run. It would be his last stand. The Ottawa leader, who had stood with Tecumseh at Moraviantown, sums it up grimly. While our great chief Tecumseh had been killed, we do not listen to one another. We do not rise together. The dream of an independent pan-Indian nation went with him. We hurt ourselves by it. The Battle of Tippecanoe. In 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe was a significant defeat for Tecumseh's American Indian Confederation. Tecumseh and the Prophet were the American names of two Shawnee natives, who were also brothers. During the early 1800s, they devised separate plans to deal with the white settlers flooding into the land. According to the Prophet, the Master of Life told him that the American Indian must give up all white customs and products. If they rejected these items and returned to traditional ways, the Master of Life would reward them by driving the white settlers from the Native American lands. Tecumseh believed that if the American Indians put aside their traditional differences and worked together, they'd be able to stop white encroachment onto the American Indian land. Tecumseh's Confederation became linked with his brother's religious movement. In 1808, the brothers moved their followers to Prophetstown near Tippecanoe River in the Indiana Territory. The two men continued to spread their messages, and their followers continued to grow in number. By 1811, many American Indians lived at Prophetstown. The white settlers in Ohio and the Indiana Territory demanded the government do something to protect them. William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory and the future president of the United States of America, led an army against Prophetstown in the fall of 1811. He stopped his force a short distance from the American Indian village. Tecumseh was away recruiting other American Indians to join his confederation. The Prophet, lacking the military skills of his brother, decided to attack the Americans. He claimed that the Master of Life had come to him and told him that the Indians would defeat the Americans. He also stated that white bullets would not harm his people. The Prophet and his forces attacked Harrison's men before daybreak on the morning of November 7, 1811. Harrison's army had approximately 1,000 troops, including infantry and cavalry. The American military defeated the American Indians, but they suffered heavy losses. 62 men killed and 126 wounded. The natives' losses were not easy to know because they carried off most of their dead and wounded. Harrison guessed that at least 40 American Indians were killed. This battle became known as the Battle of Tippecanoe, which occurred north of present-day West Lafayette, Indiana. The American army drove off the natives and burned Prophetstown to the ground. Most natives no longer believed in the Prophet. Many returned to their villages after the defeat. Tecumseh tried to resurrect his confederation, but many people refused to join him again. The Prophet's claims of invincibility contributed significantly to the collapse of Tecumseh's American Indian alliance. While Tecumseh's confederation was weakened after the Battle of Tippecanoe, Harrison's fortunes increased as he became known as Old Tippecanoe. Many years later, he used his reputation to run for president of the United States. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. The War of 1812. In the War of 1812, the United States took on the most significant naval power in the world, Great Britain, in a conflict that would have an immense impact on the young country's future. Causes of the war included British attempts to restrict U.S. trade, the Royal Navy's impressment of American seamen, and America's desire to expand its territories. The United States suffered many costly defeats at the hands of the British, Canadian, and Native American troops throughout the War of 1812, including the capture and burning of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., in August 1814. Nonetheless, American troops could repulse British invasions in New York, Baltimore, and New Orleans, boosting national confidence and fostering a new spirit of patriotism. The ratification of the Treaty of Ghent on February 17, 1815, ended the war, but left many of the most contentious questions unresolved. Nonetheless, many in the United States celebrated the War of 1812 as the Second War for Independence, beginning an era of partisan agreement and national pride. On the outset of the 19th century, Great Britain was locked in a long and bitter conflict with Napoleon Bonaparte's France. To cut off supplies from reaching the enemy, both sides attempted to block the United States from trading with the other. The Royal Navy was outraged Americans by its impressment or removing seamen from U.S. merchant vessels and forcing them to serve on behalf of the British. In 1807, Britain passed the Orders in Council, which required neutral countries to obtain a license from its authorities before trading with France and French colonies. In 1809, the U.S. Congress repealed Thomas Jefferson's unpopular Embargo Act, which hurt Americans more than either Britain or France by restricting trade. Its replacement, the Non-Intercourse Act, expressly prohibited trade with Britain and France. It also provided ineffective and, in turn, was replaced with a May 1810 bill stating that if either power dropped trade restrictions against the United States, Congress would, in turn, resume non-intercourse with the opposing force. After Napoleon hinted he would stop restrictions, President James Madison blocked all trade with Britain that November. Meanwhile, new members of Congress elected that year, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, had begun to agitate for war, based on their anger over British violations of maritime rights and Britain's encouragement of Native American hostilities against American westward expansion. In 1811, Indiana's Territory Governor William Henry Harrison led U.S. troops in the victory of the Battle of Tippecanoe. The defeat convinced many Indians in the Northwest Territory, including the celebrated Shawnee chief Tecumseh, that they needed British support to prevent American settlers from pushing them further out into their lands. Meanwhile, by late 1811, the so-called war hawks in Congress were putting more and more pressure on Madison. And on June 18, 1812, the president signed a declaration of war against Britain. Though Congress ultimately voted for the war, both House and Senate were bitterly divided on the issue. Most Western and Southern members of Congress supported the war. At the same time, Federalists, especially New Englanders who relied heavily on trade with Britain, accused war advocates of using the excuse of maritime rights to promote their expansionist agenda. To strike at Great Britain, U.S. forces almost immediately attacked Canada, a British colony. American officials were overly optimistic about the invasion's success, especially given how underprepared U.S. troops were at the time. On the other side, they were faced a well-managed defense coordinated by Sir Isaac Brock, the British soldier and administrator in Upper Canada, which is modern-day Ontario. On August 16, 1812, the United States suffered a humiliating defeat after Brock. Tecumseh's forces chased William Hull across the Canadian border, scaring Hull into surrendering Detroit without shots fired. Things looked better for the United States in the West as Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's brilliant success in the Battle of Lake Erie in September 1813 placed the Northwest Territory firmly under American control. Harrison was subsequently able to retake Detroit with a victory in the Battle of Thames, where Tecumseh was killed. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy had scored several victories over the Royal Navy in the early months of the war. With the defeat of Napoleon's armies in 1814, however, Britain was able to turn its full attention to the war effort in North America. As large troops arrived, British forces raided the Chesapeake Bay. They moved in on the U.S. capital, capturing Washington, D.C., and on August 24, 1814, and burning government buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. On September 11, 1814, at the Battle of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain in New York, the American Navy soundly defeated the British fleet. And on September 13, 1814, Baltimore's Fort McHenry withstood 25 hours of bombardment from the British Navy. The following morning, the fort soldiers hoisted an enormous American flag, a sight that inspired Francis Scott Key to write a poem that would later be set to music and become known as the Star-Spangled Banner. British forces subsequently left the Chesapeake Bay and began gathering their efforts for a campaign against New Orleans. By that time, peace talks had already begun at Ghent in modern-day Belgium, and Britain moved for an armistice after the failure of the assault on Baltimore. In the negotiations that followed, the United States gave up its demand to end impressment. At the same time, Britain promised to leave Canada's borders unchanged and abandon efforts to create an Indian state in the Northwest. On December 24, 1814, commissioners signed the Treaty of Ghent, ratified the following February. On January 8, 1815, unaware that peace had been concluded, British forces mounted a major attack in the Battle of New Orleans, only to defeat at the hands of future U.S. President Andrew Jackson's army. News of the battle boosted sagging U.S. morale and left Americans with a taste of victory, even though the country had achieved none of its pre-war objectives. Though the War of 1812 is remembered as a relatively minor conflict in the United States and Britain, it looms large for Canadians and Native Americans, who see it as a divisive turning point in their losing struggle to govern themselves. The war had a far-reaching impact in the United States, as the treaty again ended decades of bitter partisan infighting in government and ushered in the so-called era of good feelings. The war marked the demise of the Federalist Party, which had been accused of being unpatriotic for its anti-war stance. It reinforced a tradition of Anglophobia that had begun during the Revolutionary War. Perhaps almost importantly, the war's outcome boosted national self-confidence and encouraged the growing spirit of American expansionism that would shape the better part of the 19th century. The Siege of Detroit. The Siege of Detroit took place August 15, 1812, during the War of 1812. It was one of the opening actions of the conflict. In July 1812, Brigadier General William Hull conducted an abortive invasion of Canada before withdrawing back to his base at Fort Detroit. Hull was soon besieged by a smaller British and Native American force led by Major General Isaac Brock and Tecumseh, lacking in confidence despite superior numbers. Through a mix of intimidation and deception, Brock and Tecumseh were able to compel Hull's surrender of over 2,000 men while only having 2 men wounded. A humiliating defeat for the Americans, Fort Detroit would remain in British hands for over a year. As war clouds began to gather in the early months of 1812, President James Madison was encouraged by several of his key advisors, including Secretary of War William Eustis, to begin making preparations to defend the Northwest frontier. Overseen by the governor of the Michigan Territory, William Hull, the region possessed few regular troops to defend against a British invasion or attacks by Native American tribes in the area. Taking action, Madison directed that an army be formed and that it move to reinforce the critical outpost of Fort Detroit. Though he initially refused, Hull, a veteran of the American Revolution, was given command of his force with the brigadier general. Traveling south, he arrived at Dayton, Ohio on May 25th to control 3 regiments of Ohio militia led by Colonels Lewis Cass, Duncan MacArthur, and James Finley. Slowly moving north, they were joined by Lieutenant Colonel James Miller's 4th U.S. Infantry of Urbana, Ohio. Moving across Black Swamp, he received a letter from Eustis on June 26. Carried by a courier and dated June 18, it implored Hull to reach Detroit as the war was imminent. A second letter from Eustis, also dated June 18, informed the American commander that the war had been declared. Sent by regular mail, this letter did not reach Hull until July 2nd. Frustrated by his slow progress, Hull reached the mouth of the Maumee River on July 1st. Eager to speed the advance, he hired the schooner Cuyahoga and embarked on his dispatches, personal correspondence, medical supplies, and sick. Unfortunately for Hull, the British in Upper Canada were aware that a state of war existed. As a result, Cuyahoga was captured off Fort Malden by the HMS General Hunter the next day as it attempted to enter the Detroit River. Reaching Detroit on July 5th, Hull was reinforced by around 140 Michigan militia, bringing his total forces to approximately 2,200 men. Though short on food, Hull was directed by Eustis to cross the river and move against Fort Malden and Amherstburg. Advancing on July 12th, Hull's offensive was hampered by some of his militia who refused to serve outside of the United States. As a result, he halted on the east bank even though Colonel Henry Proctor, commanding officer at Fort Malden, had only 300 regulars and 400 Native Americans. As Hull was taking tentative steps to invade Canada, a mixed force of North Americans and Canadian fur traders surprised the American garrison at Fort Mackinac on July 17th. Learning of this, Hull became increasingly hesitant as he believed large numbers of Native American warriors would descend from the north. Though he had decided to attack Fort Malden on August 6th, his resolve wavered and he ordered American forces back across the river 2 days later. He was further concerned about dwindling provisions as his supply lines south of Detroit were under attack by British and native forces. While Hull spent the early days of August unsuccessfully attempting to reopen his supply lines, British reinforcements reached Fort Malden. Possessing naval control of Lake Erie, Major General Isaac Brock, the commander for Upper Canada, was able to shift troops west from the Niagara frontier. Arriving at Amherstburg on August 13th, Brock met with the noted Shawnee leader Tecumseh, and the two rapidly formed a strong rapport. Possessing around 730 regulars and militia and Tecumseh's 600 warriors, Brock's army remained smaller than his opponent. To offset his advantage, Brock combed through the captured documents and dispatched taken aboard Cuyahoga and during engagements south of Detroit. Possessing a detailed understanding of the size and condition of Hull's army, Brock also learned that its morale was low and that Hull was deeply afraid of Native American attack. Playing on this fear, he drafted a letter requesting that no more Native Americans be sent to Amherstburg and stating that he had over 5,000 on hand. This letter was intentionally allowed to fall into American hands. Shortly after that, Brock sent Hull a letter demanding his surrender and stating, "The force at my disposal authorizes me to require you the immediate surrender of Fort Detroit. It is far from my intention to join in a war of extermination. Still, you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attacked themselves to my troop will be beyond control when this contest commences." Continuing the series of deceptions, Brock ordered extra uniforms belonging to the 41st Regiment to be given to militia to make their forces appear more regular. Other ruses were conducted to deceive the Americans as the actual size of the British Army. Soldiers were instructed to light individual campfires, and several marches were undertaken to make the British force appear larger. These efforts worked to undermine Hull's already weakened confidence. On August 15, Brock commenced a bombardment of Fort Detroit from batteries on the river's east bank. The next day, Brock and Tecumseh crossed the river intending to block the American supply line and lay siege to the fort. Brock was forced to change their plans immediately as Hull dispatched MacArthur and Cass with 400 men to reopen communications to the south. Rather than be caught between this force and the fort, Brock moved to assault Fort Detroit from the west. As his men moved, Tecumseh repeatedly marched his warriors through a gap in the forest as they emitted loud war cries. This movement led the Americans to believe that the number of warriors present was much higher than in actuality. As the British approached, a ball from one of the batteries hit the officers' mess in Fort Detroit, inflicting casualties. Already badly unnerved by the situation and fearing a massacre at the hands of Tecumseh's men, Hull broke and, against the wishes of his officers, ordered a white flag hoisted and began surrendering negotiations. In the siege of Detroit, Hull lost 7 killed and 2,400 captured. In capitulating, he also surrendered MacArthur and Cass's men, as well as an approaching supply train. While the militia was patrolled and permitted to depart, the American regulars were taken to Quebec as prisoners. In the course of the action, Brock's command suffered 2 wounded. An embarrassing defeat, the loss of Detroit saw the situation in the Northwest radically transformed and quickly dashed American hopes of a triumphant march into Canada. Fort Detroit remained in British hands for over a year until being retaken by Major General William Henry Harrison in the fall of 1813 following Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's victory at the Battle of Lake Erie. Hailed as a hero, Brock's glory proved brief as he was killed at the Battle of Queenston Heights on October 13, 1812. Ben Ali. The first community of Muslims in America that have artifacts as proof of their Islamic practices are the descendants of Muhammad or Ben Ali, who lived on Sapelo Island, Georgia. The barrier islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina were characterized by a slave culture that was unique to the area. The geographic characteristics of the island created isolation of these communities, which allowed the people to preserve a rich African culture. For example, some of the most iconic cultural contributions of the Gullah and the Geechee are the song Kumbaya, which is sung in the Creole language of the people, and the Briar Rabbit stories, and the food like gumbo and shrimp and grits. Although the island's people are Christian, they are reflected by the Christian origin of the song Kumbaya. Many of them others have descendants that would practice being Muslim, who were also followers of Ben Ali, one of the island's first residents. The culture of the people of these islands became known as the Gullah or the Geechee. The Gullah, people of Sapelo Island, originally came from West Africa, where the people were experts at growing rice, indigo, and cotton. They were slaves of Thomas Spalding. Spalding was a Georgia state senator and the U.S. congressman representing Georgia between 1798 and 1806. He is reported by the New Georgia Encyclopedia to have owned 350 slaves, but to have actually disliked slavery, conveniently. Unlike many slave owners, Spalding gave his slaves many rights that most slaves did not have. For example, he required the slaves to work only 6 hours of hard labor a day. He also allowed one of his most trusted slaves, Bilal Muhammad, or Ben Ali, to supervise the other slaves and even gave them arms to defend the property when he left to serve in the War of 1812. In addition, he allowed Ben Ali to continue to practice Islam while serving as a slave on his property. In a 1933 interview, Ben's great-granddaughter described the Islamic behaviors of her great-grandparents according to the stories that have been passed down to her through her grandmother. She describes her grandmother as having worn a scarf, prayed on the bead, and to have recited words of devotion to God and the Prophet Muhammad. Ben Ali wrote fatwas and scribed Quranic verses in documents now referred to as the Ben Ali Diary. These are regarded as the first set of Islamic American jurisprudence, making Ben Ali the first Muslim American scholar. These documents are currently stored at the Haggart Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of Georgia. Until about the 1980s, a community of up to about 500 descendants of Ben Ali maintained their culture through their Creole English language, storytelling, and handicrafts. However, currently, there are only about 50 of his descendants living in the Hog's Hammock area on the island. Sadly, a lack of public resources and a very high tax rate have caused the family to move inland. Islamic artifacts from the community are displayed at Hog's Hammock Public Library. Today, many of these descendants carry the Bailey, Hall, and Walker surnames. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.